approach to things like COVID-19.
You see about that because
we start thinking about Isaiah 65. Magandang gabi po sa ating lahat dito sa Pilipinas. We would like to say good morning to our friends in America. In this session of our Bible reflections on the pandemic, we have Dr. Ron SIDER, who will speak to us about the experience in the US of the COVID pandemic, as well as the implications to the churches, both in the US and maybe globally. And we have chosen to have this title because from this area in Asia, we have been thinking that America seems to be in decline. And there is this increasing dying of democracy, not just in the Philippines, but in many places. So we would like to hear the biblical reflections of Ron in this way. And also, we are having as guest Dr. Bill Dearness, who actually co-founded ISACC with us, and he used to be dean of the theological faculty at Fuller Seminary. And moderating for us now is Grace Dearness, who's an urban anthropologist. And hopefully we will have a good discussion on how things look like in America, and a little bit maybe on the perceptions that are coming in from our part of the region. So we will start with Dr. Ron SIDER giving us what the experience of Americans have been in this COVID pandemic, what the churches actually are learning from this experience, and his own Bible reflection on all that's happening. And then Bill Dearness will also give to us some theological perspectives on the implications of all that's happening to us in the churches. So Ron, would you like to begin our conversation?
Thank you, Melba. Just a delight to see you and be with you in this way. And greetings to all of my friends in the Philippines and all the others who are listening. You know, I think it's essential to put the COVID-19 in the larger context. You know, we were in the midst of what I think is the most important presidential election in 150 years in the US. And then COVID-19 hit and basically closed down a lot of the economy and produced the worst economic disaster, probably even greater than the Great Depression. And then George Floyd was murdered, and that picture of a white policeman kneeling on him for over 8 minutes as basically he killed him, just went everywhere around the world, and massive protest, probably for the first time. Really large numbers of white people are joining African Americans in those protests. So it's all of that wrapped up in an incredible schmozzle of activity. COVID-19 was certainly handled badly in the US. Initially, the president just downplayed it and said it would go away, and didn't act responsibly. More recently, he's encouraged reopening the country, and there's a major resurgence of cases in many parts of the country, so that I think the president is clearly losing support. There was one very recent poll that indicated that white evangelical approval of Donald Trump was at 77% in March of this year, And by the end of May, it had dropped to 62%. That's a huge drop of approval in what's undoubtedly his most important constituency. I think we have to think of all of this also, you know, in the global context. The dangers that we face go way beyond COVID-19. There's a growing nationalism around the world. President Trump's Make America First, and I'm thinking only about the United States, you know, is one of the gross examples of that selfish, narrow nationalism, but it's happening in countries around the world. And of course, the larger context is the huge China-US conflict. I think the greatest threat to the safety and security of the world in the next 25 years is whether or not the US-China relationship can be handled in a peaceful way. And then, of course, there's the growing threat around the world to democratic governance. And what we need in response to you know, all of these realities, I mean, China is a problem, is a globalism that is cooperative. We need a global approach to things like COVID-19. Instead of pulling out of you know, the World Health Organization, as Donald Trump is doing, you know, we need to strengthen it. In terms of climate change, we have to have global cooperation. And if we're going to renew a commitment to democracy, democracy has been declining in the last decade in a number of places around the world. We're going to have leadership and a broad alliance of democratic nations, North America, Western Europe, Japan, Philippines, Australia, South Korea. I mean, if those countries can really unite and work together, they can counter the negative kinds of things that are coming from very undemocratic states. Well, that's kind of the broad picture that I bring to this whole picture in terms of Christian response to COVID-19 in the US. It's been very mixed. Here and there, some theologically conservative churches have said it's our right and our religious freedom to meet, even though all of the scientific experts say that in fact we shouldn't meet together in large groups because that's how COVID-19 is spread. But that was a minority. Most churches just moved to meeting on Zoom and accepted what their governors were saying about not meeting in large numbers. So the Christian response has been mixed, but I think more responsible than not in the US. Mm-hmm. Well, those are a few initial comments as I think about the setting that we're in today.
That's what you were just saying about the church and COVID, Ron, is interesting because at the same time that COVID erupted, you know, we've had the big protests in America against racism, particularly because of George Floyd, but it has this is where the influence, we still see the influence globally, right? Because everybody has picked that up around the world and have tried to say racism is an issue in our countries too. Mm-hmm. And it's that younger generation. And we're finding out here in California, some churches that are saying, we will not speak out about that because that's political. And so they are keeping from speaking out and saying, we only follow this and we don't get involved in politics. So Ron, what do you see about that? Because this is something that we don't want spreading across the globe into, you know, the Christian response. Can you speak to those kind of attitudes that says Black Lives Matter is a political movement, not a social justice movement? because I see the young people are really engaging with this, and we will lose them all if the church doesn't find a place to welcome this kind of conversation.
Yeah, well, that response, namely that we can't talk about racism, white racism, because that's political, is especially ironic since the evangelical church overwhelmingly has gotten up to its ears in politics in the last several decades.
Exactly.
81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, and they continue to be way ahead in terms of percentages of all other Americans in ongoing support, even though there is some indication in the last couple of months that evangelical support is declining. In March of this year, polls indicated that 77% of white evangelicals approved of Donald Trump. By the end of May, that had dropped to 62%. I actually edited a book called The Spiritual Danger of Donald Trump. The subtitle is 30 Evangelical Christians on Justice, Truth, and Moral Integrity. And the book is talking about how evangelicals need to apply biblical principles as they think about the current president and the current election. But actually, I think that there is some hope in the response to George Floyd's killing somehow. I mean, there had been African Americans killed by white policemen again and again and again regularly, you know, for a long, long time. Not to mention 100 years ago when lynching was, and more than 100 years ago, lynching was common. And of course, slavery before that. So there's a long, long white history. I actually did a blog on white evangelicals, racism, and George Floyd, Our Hour of Decision. And by all odds, it was the most widely read blog that I've ever done. Just massive support. And people from Jim Wallace to Al Sharpton, the African-American political leader from New York who gave the address at the funeral of George Floyd in Houston. And they're saying that something is different about the demonstrations, massive, widespread, ongoing demonstrations day after day in the US, not to mention around the world. And here they're saying that the difference is that there are a lot more white people that are in those demonstrations. It's not just African Americans now who are protesting. So I am somewhat hopeful that, in fact, this time round, white Christians are getting it and beginning to act. Of course, the awareness that what happened to Floyd was wrong and that shouldn't be repeated, that's different from understanding the structural foundations and the structural bases of racism in the society, which are still serious. But I think even that maybe can be opened up in a new way. I'm modestly hopeful about all of that.
Yeah.
You think it has the making of another civil rights movement, that kind of scale or magnitude?
You know, I think it's much too early to just assert that that's what's happening. But there are signs of that. Front page New York Times story today was about a white friend of a black activist, and the white friend, I think they were both in university together, a few months ago had been arguing, and the white friend was conservative. All of a sudden, the black activists saw that her white friend had been physically abused by a policeman, and she was out protesting against white racism. Just one little indication, but it's front page New York Times, so that they think it's not just an isolated incident. So I have some hope.
Yeah, I think that the movement right now, Black Lives Matter, is different from the civil rights movement in a couple of ways. One is that it's much more active and not it's not going to put up with just some general moves in a reform. And the other is that it's been led by women. Black Lives Matter was founded and led by women. So, you know, we amazing what this says to us theologically, both of the COVID, because I think it isn't coincidental that these two things are happening at the same time, where COVID-19 is opening up a veil and letting us see the inequalities of a system that is actually, you know, destroying our lives, really our lives. And there's no coincidence that these two are happening together. They're intricately related. What do you want to?
Couple of things. First of all, some of us have been talking now. The civil rights movement accomplished a great deal in allowing people into the political previously had a voice. And even giving them a space and a place in the culture that they didn't have before. And at the end of his life, Martin Luther King was moving from simple opposition to racism to, for example, housing. That was the thing that bothered him and that he spoke on the day actually before he was shot. So that they were moving in that direction. But in fact, that hasn't happened. Now, what's happening is that all of those voices at the table and a voice, they're demanding now that the system be changed. And I think that's what this opportunity is allowing for us. It's opening a space. And if we don't take advantage of it, especially people of faith, and I think all the people of faith could profitably have that conversation. And I'm struck by we need to return to Isaiah, that they will be living out their lives until up to 100. Anybody dies before 100 will be considered accursed. And then there's they plant and eat. In other words, they are using and getting the benefits of their work. That is, they're not just wage slaves, but they're getting productive use and benefit from what the work that they're doing. And then they, before you call, I will answer. They now have a voice, and God will hear them, and God will speak on their behalf. And so that there will be a peace, a new kind of peace, that the lions and the lambs will lie down together. There'll be a shalom in culture. So I think these kinds of themes we need to look for and say those are places where God is at work.
Melba, does that resonate with what's going on in the Philippines?
Oh yes, certainly. I think we probably need to think more economics because our OFWs have been repatriated, many of them, and that's a huge thousands of our workers coming back. And then, of course, we have lots of people in the informal sector, all of these no pay kinds of jobs. So that means that we have about 7 who are unemployed jobs in the formal and that in informal sector of Ws coming back and being repatriated from Syria and all oil. It's a massive problem economically. I mean, like many other countries, and it looks like we probably need, when we're thinking about the so-called new normal, what does it mean to see to it that people are able to eat what they plant, you know, like what Bill was. What does it mean to build an economy where the health of people is prioritized? You know, like this, you know, you live more than 100, no, you're considered a curse if you're only, in other words, the priority of health and seeing to it that people are of sound mind and sound, and this, how do we translate this? I wish economists were start thinking about Isaiah 65. What does it mean to put in place structures so that we are able to get to a place where people do not have to go out, you know, or become construction workers in Saudi Arabia when they themselves have no houses.
Yeah.
I mean, we produce lots of export crops. And I remember being in Japan and I saw all of these nice bananas. And then when we were having dinner, I saw all these really prawns, you know, really nice. And I said, where do you get this? Oh, it's from the Philippines. And then, you know, I start having all this fruit and I said, oh, this is nice, mangoes. And so we have mangoes in the Philippines. Oh, that's really from the Philippines. So at the end of it, I was getting a bit angry because we are not getting that quality crop, you know. In other words, we get the leftovers.
Yeah.
And all the bananas that are left over, you know, they did not pass quality control. And I said, they get all the best seeds of what we plant.
Yeah.
You know, and I said, how do we, it's unfortunate, I'm not an economist, but how do we change the system in such a way that people can really eat what they produce?
Yeah.
And we don't just export everything and we get the leftovers, you know, where we are. So this is, the vision in Isaiah 65 is very important for us in this way.
I see that as a fundamental economic principle, that people eat what they plant. And they eat, they have an expression in Africa where you're eating. That is that you're profiting from the system. So you're eating. I like that. I don't like the way it's used in Africa most of the time because they're eating in corrupt ways. But the idea that you eat what you plant or you profit from what you make is a fundamental economic principle that's violated all the time by the system as it works now. And then you build a house and then you live in it.
We're all talking about, you know, the basic biblical teaching that God and God's people have a special concern for the poor and demand justice. And that means a demand for systems that are fair to everyone.
Right.
I think it's important to speak carefully about things like global trade because I think that it's an accurate economic summary that one of the major reasons that 1 to 2 billion Asians have come out of poverty, have been lifted out of poverty in the last 30 years is because of global trade. But that global trade has had injustice into it. There hasn't been the proper concern for the rights of the workers, the people at the bottom. Too much of the profits have gone to a few wealthy people at the top, and the kind of thing, Melba, you talk about, where poor people in the Philippines are producing great mangoes and so on for rich Japanese. That's a problem. It's not that global trade is a bad idea, not that Philippines selling mangoes to Japan is a bad idea, but it has to be within a system where in each country there's economic justice for everybody, for the workers especially, and a concern for the environment. And we haven't had those kinds of concerns built in to the kind of global system that has developed in the last 30, 40, especially the last 30, 40 years.
Well, Gracie was saying something about this pandemic, sort of revealing things. It's a kind of, in the language of Ruth Padilla, we have experienced an apocalypse in a way. It's this unveiling of all the injustices in the system. Mm-hmm. And even for instance, now there is a consciousness that we must plant things in our backyards because of the lockdown. Even if we have lots of produce elsewhere, it cannot get into the city. And people were saying now, even if you have lots of money, it's very difficult to get food. So now people like to move towards the globalizing at least the source of food, that the food should be at least, planted by all of us in our backyards, in whatever idle lands there may be in the city, and so on, so that we don't go hungry. And I think this trend towards the globalizing is a good one, at least in relation to food, I think, because, that is the very basic thing that our poor need. And also, it has revealed the difficulty of so many who are in the informal sector. We have a very large informal sector and very few big companies actually, but very, very large informal sector who are hardly, and now suddenly it's revealed that they're all starving because there is no job, no pay, no job. And for the first time, it's highlighting the fact that you have so many in the informal sector.
Yeah. Melba, my question is, the Bible speaks of a jubilee, right? And for many years now, and probably Ron SIDER got the ball rolling on this, where Christians began talking about jubilee economics. And, there's now with this COVID and the unveiling, you actually see the secular world talking about a jubilee economics. The Washington Post was putting it out, and different sources talking about jubilee economics. There is a time, and churches have to be prepared. We were on a webinar where churches are doing some creative things with their land. They're located in communities, but now they're taking the land and putting farms there or plots to grow things, as well as businesses, so that it's all in the same radius. And the church is getting rid of the huge land holdings that they have to make it work for the community. I think those are some positive signs that are happening of how jubilee economics might work.
I think we need to do that, and all kinds of things of that sort, with local churches is marvelous. What you say, Melba, about just, small people in the Philippines growing some food in a little space in a backyard or whatever. All of that is marvelous. I think we need that along with a broad analysis of what structures are unjust and what needs to be changed. I think the way I've talked about the Jubilee principle is to say, in the Old Testament, every family had their own land, and in an agricultural society, land was the basic capital. That was the basic way that you earned an income. And I think and then Jubilee says every 50 years, the land goes back to the original owners. Apparently God wants a situation where everybody continues to have access to the basic capital so that they can act responsibly and have a decent life. So I think the principle there is God wants every person to have access to the capital resources so they can earn their own way and be dignified members of the society. Now, in a knowledge society, it's not primarily land, although in some parts of the world, land still is the basic capital. But in a knowledge society, it's certainly education. And that means we ought to have quality education for all of our kids, not just to white
Right.
suburbanites as we have in the US, but also millions and millions of inner city African-American and Latino, especially kids. So we have to ask the structural question that relates to healthcare. I mean, COVID-19 has revealed that twice as many African-Americans get COVID-19 and die as white Americans. And that's because they don't have health insurance in as high a level as white people. They don't have access to good food in many inner city settings. So they have a variety of health problems that make them more susceptible to COVID-19. And the basic structural answer is we got to have health insurance for everybody. Surely that's a pro-life issue. So by all means, do everything we can in terms of local stuff, churches with their land and small gardens, but it's not either that or structural. It's both of those things at the same time.
Yeah, and I just want to interrupt here a minute and welcome all of our viewers or people that are out there listening in. We hope that you are finding this a provocative discussion and hope we can hear some comments from you, Ron. And one of the things that we need to look at in what's happening is this return to authoritarianism that many places have even our country. I think that we'll call him by name, but it's the other countries. It's almost like we've lost democracy. So Melba, where you are and the other trends, I mean, these leaders all can fall into one category of looking out for myself and building my empire and not caring about the rest of the country. What do you see, Melba, out there?
Well, in our context, I think the return of authoritarianism is really because of the disillusionment with the kind of democracy that we have. It's a very elitist kind of democracy where you have a very small group of people who actually have the monopoly of both political and economic power. And the succeeding governments after people power have not been able to dismantle these structures. Ron was saying, you know, we need to look at the whole structural system. But the trouble is our ruling elite is able to monopolize all power in such a way that the poor people, the underclasses, have very, very much aware that they are not just marginalized, they really have been swept away. And so, you know, with all the so-called neo-capitalist democracies, you know, sort of trading with China and all the rest of it, and this small elite flourishing in unprecedented ways. And then at the same time, you have masses of people getting poorer and poorer. And I think this disillusionment about the kind of democracy that has been restored to us, quote unquote, during the people power, has made people turn to people like, populist figures like Duterte. And I don't know about the rest of the countries, but I think that's the thing. And there's this sense that this democracy is dysfunctional. Let's move towards having somebody who can have a strong arm, you know, to do the kind of reforms that we have been longing for. Now, this is, I think, two things. One is, I think, unlike maybe in the US or in Europe, where it has had, 4 or 5 centuries of evolution from arbitrary rule to an autocratic rule to more sort of constitutional monarchies and finally democracy, as in the US, we have not had that kind of journey. I mean, after colonization, suddenly you find yourself as a nation state. And people have not had, I think, the shift that is necessary from thinking that we are subjects to a king to we are now citizens of a republic. And so if a strong man comes along, we treat them like a king. I mean, even if we elect them, one of our commentators was saying, we thought we elected a president. We did not elect a king, but people behave as if they are subjects to a king. And I think, well, a lot of it is economics too, because whoever has the levers of power, certainly, I mean, whether you're a politician or poor people, you sort of attach yourself to whoever has that power. And that has, I think, has not been changed, that kind of mentality. I always say in our language, we're still alipin sa gigilid. In other words, we still have this slave mentality, and we sort of attach ourselves to whoever has the power. And I think the church has not changed that kind of mindset.
No,
in other words, the kind of biblical reflection and teaching that people get in the churches has not touched in any way these very deep structures in our consciousness. You know, not just the social structures, but the deep structures in our consciousness, that we are no longer slaves to a king. We are citizens, and we can make them accountable. That very rarely you find, among the underclasses, except for what we call our netizens. We don't really have that language of, making the powers accountable.
I think there are some very basic biblical principles that that relate to this. I think that the Bible obviously tells us that every person is created in the image of God, and every person is invited by God to be a shaper of history. Now, if just a few tiny people have all the power, then most of us can't exercise our positive mandate from the Lord to be shapers of history. There's a negative reason for not concentrating power, and that is that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And in a sinful world, people who have unchecked power are almost certainly going to use it for their own selfish advantage. And we see that again and again. And I don't think the Bible says that democracy is the only political system, but I think that there are good biblical principles that suggest that democracy is better. Winston Churchill said that democracy is a terrible form of government. It's the worst possible government except for all the other alternatives. I think there's some truth to that, because it decentralizes power. If every person really has a vote, that decentralizes power. If you have legislative and judicial and administrative parts of government that are really independent, that decentralizes power. If you have genuine freedom of speech, freedom of the press, that decentralizes power. And I think that all around the world, we're seeing moves toward a concentration of power and an undermining of those various ways that in a democratic society, power is genuinely decentralized. We see it in the US with the way that Donald Trump denounces any newspaper or news media source that he doesn't like as fake news. That's a fundamental threat to democracy. And I think Christians around the world need to say that we're committed to religious freedom, we're committed to economic justice, we're committed, because of both of those things, to a decentralization of power, and therefore genuine democratic governance is one part of how we implement those biblical principles. But this is going to be a long struggle.
Yeah, this is a good segue into a question that somebody has posed to you. and they see that peace and order situation both in the Philippines and in the U.S. in the U.S. is deteriorating in compared to the Philippines, where there is peace and order held together by an autocratic person. But they're asking you, Ron, and perhaps you, Bill, do you agree with the protesters? Does going to the street now provide a solution to the problems? Please answer this, because we are divided on this. And I think you talked about structures, changing the structures. And one of the ways that they're seeking to do the change is by getting out in the streets and not allowing it to go quiet and saying, we will be here until we see some of these structures change. What do you think, Ron, about this question? And does going to the street provide a solution to the problem?
Yeah, well, I think that there's no question but that the current president puts basic democratic processes under threat. But I think our basic political processes, the independence of the judiciary, and so on, is still quite strong and is going to resist that. Now, let me relate that directly to what's happening in the demonstrations. Overwhelmingly, those demonstrations are peaceful. Now, there are some instances of rioting and burning buildings. That's wrong. That is both immoral and contradictory to a democratic approach to saying everybody has the freedom of speech to say what they think and what ought to be changed, and they have the political right to demonstrate, but not to burn buildings and attack people. So furthermore, it's politically counterproductive. The more that the demonstrators in the US, in fact, commit violence, the more they play into the hands of people like President Trump. But the truth is that on balance, they have been peaceful. And too often the police have used excessive force. Sometimes the police have marched with them and taken a knee with them. That's wonderful. And it's certainly the demand to rethink how much money we spend on police forces and expensive military equipment for the police. That's all important. But it would be a fundamental mistake to say that we should just get rid of the police. Let's do everything we can nonviolently in terms of the police, but we need police. We need to have them be just and fair and not racist in the way they act. And it's clear that that has continued to be a big problem. And the current protests are highlighting that, I think, in a very successful way that I think will produce change. But what we need is peaceful protests to demand genuine democratic change.
Well, I think that there's a theological principle at stake here that Ron has already referred to, and that is that each person is created in the image of God. But throughout Scripture, it is God who hears the cries of people. In Egypt, where Israel was under slavery, it says in the beginning of Exodus, they cried out. It doesn't even say they cried out to God. They maybe had forgotten God, but God heard their cry. And it's God who hears the cries of the people. In Isaiah 17, this is very clear. Before they answer, I have heard them. I've already heard them. Now, if God hears the cries of the people, how much more government leaders are required? The mandate that they have is to hear the cries of the people and to respond in a way that's equitable and just.
Yeah. And wouldn't it be great if they had ears to hear? So often, what power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But Philippines has led the way for all the world in terms of peaceful protests. With the overthrow of Marcos. Everybody follows that and keeps referring back to the Filipino example. And I think the majority of the protesters on the streets here are taking that model, and it's very mixed racially and very young group. They are not going to put up with things the way they were. Bill had brought up Isaiah 65, and Veronica here is saying, I hope the Christian churches will not shy away from tackling Isaiah 65 and start talking about it with the people at this time when we are being given the opportunity to design the new normal, which must be just, compassionate, inclusive, and respectful of the environment and all life forms. I love that she brought this up. What would you say is a way forward to incorporating Isaiah 65 into our churches? All three of you need to respond to that. Maybe starting with Ron, and then Melba, and then Bill.
Well, I must confess I haven't read that text immediately recently, but all of the things that the person posing the question talks about is appropriate, I think, grounded in biblical norms. You know, the Bible calls us to be in charge of, in a loving, responsible way, of the rest of creation, and demands that we create systems of justice for everybody. So yes, I agree that all the things that this person has pointed to from Isaiah are important. You know, the tragedy of the church is that we so often fall so short of what Jesus and the scriptures call us to. White Americans, especially white evangelicals, have fallen so far short in terms of racial justice. But the biblical norm is there, Jesus is there, the Holy Spirit is there. So I think every new generation of Christians have God's invitation to be more faithful in the power of the Spirit, to live out that whole biblical mandate.
Great. Melba?
Well, I must say that where we are at the moment, the democratic space has become very, very narrow. And all the institutions are in Duterte's pocket, no? You have the Congress, you have Senate, you have the Supreme Court, you have the whole bureaucracy, the military, and the police. So where do you go? How do you do this? And it looks like people power, while it has had very good inspirational force, you know, for many other movements. I think it is a spent force here in the Philippines. So I have been thinking carefully about what Ron has been saying about structures. How do we actually do this? I have begun to think that perhaps it's important that we need to be more intentionally subversive. There are lots of Christians in government, for instance, and I would like to see them bit by bit doing reforms within their own sphere of competence and responsibility. I'm reminded of these professional Christians in government in Singapore. I was told that 80% of the Singapore's bureaucracy is actually Christian. And I don't know if that explains the fact that, you know, relatively Singapore is squeaky clean in its governance. And I would like to be able to see professionals, economists, for instance, thinking carefully about this mandate from Isaiah 65. What does it mean to develop an economy that really keeps our people here and allows them to have their own house, their own food, etc., and get away from the capitalist paradigm or the socialist paradigm, because both of these paradigms don't work for us. So it's important to build, I think, on our culture, build on what we have, the resources that we have. And Philippines is very, very rich. one of our economists was saying we need to be more sea-based rather than land-based because we are seafarers and we have a very long coastline. And we could easily become an international port, you know, like Singapore. But we don't move in that direction. We think simply of exporting our people, you know, as if they are pineapples or, you know, all these export crops. So it's important, I think, for Christian economists to think more carefully about an alternative paradigm so that we have a more just economic structure. And the same with all the other professionals. I think the health system, we export our medical personnel. And one of my friends in the UK was saying to me, you know, the Filipino presence of the medical profession, in the hospitals, particularly the state hospitals in the UK, you have all these Filipinos now, she says, and if you remove all of them, the National Health Service will collapse, she said. And I said, how come, you know, the Filipino medical workers feel that they're actually being discriminated upon in the sense that they are the first to be pushed, you know, to becoming frontliners and not the British ones. But I think it's important to now to think about the health system and all these very competent medical personnel to start how to mend this broken system that we have so that, you know, our people will have some health. I myself, even if I'm middle class, I'm very afraid of getting COVID. Not so much that I will not recover, but because of the huge 1 million peso bill that I will incur, you know, if I in hospital.
Yeah.
No, because we don't have medical insurance, you know. Yeah. So it's important to think carefully about how to put these structures, and I think that you know, going to the streets is no longer possible because the democratic space has become narrow. We don't have still, I mean, America still has strong institutions. You can still go to the courts. You can still do this, you know. No, there's no appeal whatsoever. So I think it's important for church people who are in government or in some business or whatever sphere of power and influence they may have to be more in attention. We subvert the structures. We can't do it, you know, sort of in a very sort of noisy kind of way. But I think when I'm thinking about, for instance, what has happened in the early church, where Paul, in his writings, they had, you know, they had no direct sort of confrontation with the Caesars, you know, with the government, because that's, you know, they're under absolutist rule. But the relationships were transformed, you know, relationships, master and slave and all this, which eventually, I think, eroded the structures. And I think this is why in scripture we have this metaphor of the yeast, you know. The yeast somehow, slowly, quietly, in ways that we do not know, eventually transforms and becomes, you know, becomes this bread suddenly. So I think maybe we need to think a little more carefully what it means to subvert the institutions where the Lord has placed us.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's kind of a good point, since we only have about 5 minutes left, that we might have our last words. And Bill, I wonder if you want to respond to this. I know that there have been some comments also on the chat saying that, you know, maybe protests start, you know, democratically and peacefully, but end up violent. And so we can't always join protests. However, I think let's focus our time now on a way forward, like Melba was just saying, with the church, and where do we hear from God for the way forward, wherever the pathway takes us?
Just very, very briefly, we need to recover, and Ron has emphasized this, our biblical scriptural basis for these things, because Jesus, in his first sermon in Luke chapter 4, cited Isaiah 62 and 58, which are Jubilee passages. And he ended the sermon by saying, "This day has this been fulfilled in your ears," which means that Jesus conceived of his ministry, his life and death, as a Jubilee event. That is at the end of the age, and the resurrection is the first event of the end of the age, so that we are in a Jubilee period. So if, as Melba said, if people had the idea when they go into the government service, how do we make the Jubilee a reality in this place? And realizing that either they're going to subvert that space into Jubilee, or they're going to be subverted and corrupted into, which is what usually happens, unfortunately, into the system, rather than seeing this as a possibility to change. How that can be done, I think Paul models this in 2 Corinthians when he talks about the collection as an economic model of a community of mutual benefit, where it's not as though and this applies to, I think, trade that you mentioned earlier, Ron, where it's not as though we're trying to make somebody disadvantaged and then advantage somebody else, but that we're working toward equality, where we have an exchange which mutually benefit each other. And that's a basic economic principle. And I believe Paul was modeling that in his own thinking on the teaching of Jesus and principles like Isaiah 65 and so forth.
Ron, what would your last words be of encouragement to our listeners as they try to live in a Jubilee way, in a new way, breaking down the structures that aren't working? I love this idea of getting into the offices and beginning to look for a path of Jubilee. What is God saying to us all, Ron, that we need to hear from?
I think that Christians always should try to be living out the fullness of what the Bible says God cares about, and what that means in terms of the institutions and structures of society. Now, the amount of space or freedom or opportunity that Christians have to do that has varied enormously over history. You know, in the Soviet Union, Christians had no political influence. All they could do is try to live out their own values within their common life. That was true of the early church. They had no political influence. As we look at Christians in China and the Philippines and the US and Western Europe, you know, a great deal of variation in terms of what Christians are able to do. I think to the extent that they can, they should very much do what Melba's talking about, think through the kinds of structural changes which would make the world more just. Sometimes all we can do is just try to live out within the body of Christ, faithfulness. And even that model has the impact long-term of influencing and shaping the larger society. But in many places, Christians have enormous structural opportunities, and we ought to be vigorously using it in the US and Western Europe, you know, and in many, many places around the world.
And I do think that it comes down to the theology of accompaniment, right? God is accompanying us on this pathway. We accompany others on the pathway of justice and peace, and we work for it knowing God is walking with us. Amen. I think that gives us this courage and the strength to hang in there, even when those around us want to make us be corrupt, so to speak. This has been a really, really rich discussion and so much more. that we could learn from our listeners if we had the time. And we want to thank them for actually listening in. Thank you for joining us. We are grateful for that. You can also be watching out for ISACC is going to have more of these media opportunities and have more thinking biblically about what is happening right now in our world. And we're in a global world, which is why these are global conversations. Coming up soon is Dr. Samuel Escobar. He's living in Spain, but he's from Latin America, and we will be getting that perspective. So please keep tuned to that. And if you have special topics that you want to pitch, you can post them in the comments or message them, send them to ISACC, and the media team will gather them and put a program together, hopefully, if there's enough interest. So Ron, on behalf of Bill and myself, thank you for giving us this opportunity. We are honored. And Melba, thank you so much. Always, I learned so much.
Thank you to all of you.
After all these years, and I'm still learning from you. And it's like such an honor to be on this webinar with you.
I would just add the same thing. Melba has been a hero and model to me for decades. I so admire and respect the kind of leadership you've given. So may God watch over you, protect you, and guide you at this time.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for all of you. The Lord has given us really good friends.